I'm the only person at the symposium who didn't have a name tag. They looked and looked and said, no, you don't. It's okay. It's all right. But I'm also the only person at the symposium whose picture is at the entrance, where it says, this guy's going to talk to them. And so maybe they just thought I was supposed to like wear the giant. So here we are in our panel about how do we best serve, particularly as it's in the United States, victims of labor trafficking. I come from the UK. I know I don't sound like it, but we don't use it. We don't divide the terms in the same way. We don't talk about labor trafficking and sex trafficking. We talk about modern slavery, and we talk about enslavement into commercial sexual exploitation, and enslavement into different types of labor as necessary. But in the United States, I'm going to try and stick with your lingo. The reason we don't do it quite the way you do is because we feel that the word trafficking is actually just a process. Human trafficking is a process which takes you into a situation of enslavement. And that if it doesn't, whatever that movement is, it doesn't take you into a situation of enslavement, then it's probably smuggling or something else. And that it's an odd way to, in fact, Lou DeBaca, people remember Lou DeBaca, the head of the tip office in the State Department? He used to say, calling it human trafficking is really a little bit like saying the crime is driving to the bank instead of robbing the bank. And he used to say he would name his own office in the State Department the slavery office, not the trafficking person office. So that's just a little plug. I think we have to think about our nomenclature just a little bit more. I think you have read up on our panelists. Gonzalo, Bill, Gibbon. Gibbon I've known since he was 18. Ninth grade. He was cute. I want to let you know that, and he's not so bad now, but I just want you to know what a cute guy. He has a unique perspective of being a survivor, and Bill I've also known since he was in the ninth grade, but it was 10th grade. Yeah. Actually, it's been quite a long time because we've worked in this space together. And Gonzalo I've only met not that long ago, particularly when he was working for Humanity United, and done good work. One of the things I'm excited about this panel is that we have lots of panels about problems, and in some ways I'm hoping that this might best be a panel about solutions. Because our remit here is how do we best serve? Right? How do we best serve the people who have been caught up in that situation? And I really hope to focus on that. I was not long ago, I think we're beginning to have a trend now across the movement of people saying, let's stop having sessions of papers, conferences just about the difficulties, and let's focus some now on some of the solutions. I was just recently at a very large conference at Yale, and the name of the conference was What Works? Just that, what works? And it was like, we don't want to hear about the problems. We want to hear about what works. Some people still came up and said, nothing works. But at least there were quite a few contributors who came up with some interesting ideas about things that were, it was very inspiring. And one of those, particular contributors were several people from the Coalition of Immokalee Workers. The coalition who do the work in South Florida. And of course their work has become so successful that now big foundations are giving them prizes just for being them, because it really, really works. That's what I want us to be able to look forward to, and I hope we can do that. Given, I'd like you to start off just with, I'd like to ask each of you, what's your particular perspective here? What do you know about what happens, what happens when people are caught up in forced labor, but more importantly, if you in a general sense, I'd be very keen to know if you have a first idea about what works in terms of helping people pass it.
Yeah, I think, like you said, I have a unique perspective on trafficking because I'm a survivor of human trafficking, and I came from Zambia in 1998, which is a group known as the Zambia Boys Choir.
Can you hear him?
Can
You'll need to speak up.
I need to speak up. I need to stand up.
Yeah.
Why don't I stand up?
Then I won't feel bad.
I think, like Kevin said, I have a little bit of a unique perspective on trafficking. I was a survivor of, I am a survivor, I guess, of human trafficking. And I came from Zambia in 1998. I came to the United States with the Zambia Boys Choir, and I had hopes of, raising funds for schools back home in my country, and that turned out not to be a great situation. It ended up becoming a human trafficking situation, and I know what it took for me to get out of that situation to be standing here today, speaking in front of you, was a lot of courage. And that took people standing up in my situation and saying that, okay, here are kids who need a lot of help. So what are we going to do to try to help them so that they have a better future in life for themselves? And for me, the biggest factor for that was my mom, who is here in the audience today. And I'm going to be very brief so that I don't kind of feel lost in the whole thing here. But she stood up for me and was there to help me out, and Kevin and the organization that they came up with, and they were there to kind of stand in and try to help us out. But the biggest thing that for me was, trying to get the paperwork to stay in the United States, and so that if you're young, I guess you could try to go to school. If you're older, I guess you could try to get a job, and so that you can help yourself. And in a lot of cases, you don't want to, if you're rescued in the United States, you don't want to go back to your home country because you don't know what's going to happen to you when you're back in your country. Because a lot of times when you've been trafficked into this country, the traffickers are going to intimidate you and telling you that, if you go back to your country, we can kill you, we can kill your families and whatnot. So just having somebody there for you, somebody that you can trust, and building that trust takes a lot of time, because a lot of times victims don't want to just speak up. They're afraid to speak up about what's happening to them. But I don't know who to trust. When you've been in a situation like that, you've been in it, a year, 2, 3, 4, 5 years, when you're speaking to somebody, the first thing you question is, okay, what is this individual trying to get from me? Can I trust this individual? So a lot of them end up building this fence, and trying to penetrate through that fence is very, very hard. It just takes a lot of persistence and just you being honest in that, I'm not here to hurt you in any way, form, or shape. I'm just here to help you out so that you can also get your freedom and life. And I think, life is hard for all of us. I think we're all just trying to survive in one way or another. And but if you can make your life, if you can use your life to improve somebody else's life, I believe that's what we all should be trying to do. So I'm not going to speak a whole lot. I think that
we'll come back for now. We're going to go around and around. Good. Thank you. Yeah.
Well, glad to hear people say all that. So I was just thinking as he was talking, I hadn't thought about this till then, but in 2002 and 2003, some of us put together a conference on trafficking we held in Dallas, and our keynote speaker. In 2002 and 2003, some of us, some organizations put together a conference on trafficking in Dallas, and Kevin Bales was our keynote. That's when I met Given and Sandy, and and I'm just really encouraged to hear, what everybody said so far. We say the same thing. Trafficking is trafficking. It's an American concept of sex trafficking, labor trafficking. Trafficking means coercion, somebody using coercion to control another person. If that's happening, whatever the industry is, it's trafficking. And again, the U.S. government today is using the word, again, Kevin said the terminology is wrong. Today, the U.S. government is using the word modern slavery to talk about what their view is of slavery, because that's what it is. It's about something that has nothing to do with movement. That's how we got introduced to it. That's how we became aware of what's happening in the world today, or what we started term as trafficking. So what I really like to talk about is why don't we identify cases of trafficking more easily? We know pretty much from extrapolation from a lot of studies that there's a lot more labor trafficking in the world than there is sex trafficking, and yet all we see is sex trafficking on the news, on media, and everywhere. So why is that? Well, it comes back down really to what Gibbon said. People build a fence around themselves, they're protecting themselves, they're careful. When I do presentations, sometimes I have a PowerPoint, and one of the early slides I use in the presentation shows this group of young boys from Zambia singing in the choir, and it's, one of them over at the end is Gibbon, and then at the end of my presentation I show Gibbon as a dentist diving into somebody's mouth, and so it's a nice thing. But it's really uplifting. But that's the reality. Why don't people self-disclose? I mean, and I'm going to give a quick example. Feel free to stop me if I go on, but I'm going to try to be brief with the example. There's a group of women who basically traipsed across Mexico, ended up here in Fort Worth, were working, and some really alert officers of the Fort Worth Vice Unit with the police department identified that this was a case of trafficking, started reporting it to the federal government. It took a year to get attention. This was back when the law first passed. Finally, a big raid was conducted. Some women were taken into custody. They were interviewed. It's a long story. Some of them were referred to us. The agency where I work is Mosaic Family Services, and we try to have comprehensive services. Maybe I'll talk when we get into the service idea. I'll talk about that later. I'll tell you what we do. But at the time, the women that went to and not all were identified by law enforcement as trafficked people. Some were sent back to the home in Honduras, even though they might have been in the same situation. But the ones that they thought were trafficked were sent to us. So when they're at our shelter, one of our case managers, one of our counselors was going to the shelter for anybody who wanted to talk. And the typical story would be, nobody was controlling me. I wasn't enslaved. I got into this on my own. I owed a lot of money in my country. And things got worse and worse for me. I couldn't pay off the debt. Finally, I was offered, if you raise the money to go to America, as all of y'all know, in America, money falls from the skies. I mean, I think that's, I was brushing it off my shoulders so I came in. Maybe the wind was too windy when you came. So what did you expect to do? And well, I expected to be maybe working as a hostess in a restaurant, doing some massages, stuff like that. So you didn't expect to do what you would do. But no, I didn't speak English. I had to pay back. I owed money. I had to pay off the loan. And there's a lot that goes with that. Somebody's surrounded by their own people, speaking their own language, and suddenly it's like icy water. They're trying to talk to law enforcement who's doing what they're supposed to be doing, taking them out of that situation. But they don't know what's going on. They're afraid for their family. In addition to all that, we all hear about post-traumatic stress. If you're in a situation, post-traumatic stress is when you're in a situation where you can't flee or fight. We all know about fight or flee situation, right? Syndrome, right? When you're in danger, you either run away or you fight back. When you can't do that, the cognitive part of your brain shuts down. It's a cognitive part of your brain right now that's listening, thinking, this is really good. I like listening to these guys. So we want to keep that going. But when that shuts down, you just want to survive. Sleep, eat, and so on. So suddenly somebody tell me your story. What's going on? How did you get here? What are you doing? Those are questions that you're really not able to answer at that point. So we don't see self-disclosure. We don't see people making an outcry. That's sort of the reality that we're trying to get past. And we've really, I'll tell you, we've served hundreds of trafficked persons over the years. We've really seen in the last couple of 3 years a huge increase, a steady increase in the number of cases being referred. So things are really starting to happen in all kinds of trafficking. So with that encouraging note, I'll leave it to the next opportunity.
Okay. That was great, Bill, and I someday hope to be as deadpan as you are. But you didn't say much about what are the best things that we can help. So we're going to come back to everybody and ask that question. Okay. Gonzalo.
Okay, so by way of introduction, very briefly, again, my name is Gonzalo Martinez. I'm managing a new initiative here in Texas called the McCain Institute Initiative to Combat Modern Slavery. We really focus in on a very specific typology of human trafficking, which is forced or coerced labor in agriculture. And within that, we are actually only piloting in 74 counties, sort of the northwest and the south area of Texas. You can guess why, based on the heat map above. It's easy to keep it short if we're going to focus on what's working, because usually I spend most of my time, when it comes to this topic, analyzing everything that is failing about identifying and responding to the cases. Bill already started sort of previewing all of that. I'm sure many of you are aware of the issues. So just to kind of cut to the chase and tell you what we have found to work in the little time that we've been here. A little more background, we have 7 different strategies right now against forced and coerced labor in ag. We basically are funding anything that we think is working or may potentially work to reduce the risk of these cases happening and to address the ones that are already ongoing. So that means we fund the legal aid to keep doing the amazing work they do, seeking civil remedies and immigration remedies for human trafficking survivors. We fund governmental agencies. We are now publicly talking about plans that we have in Hidalgo County to fund a full-time specialty prosecutor and a full-time specialty investigator to focus on agricultural labor trafficking. That will be the first in the nation to have a unit that's honed in. And it's a good place for it. Again, based on the map behind us here, where the risk is, that's where you want the resources to begin to focus in on the cases. We heard about the Coalition of Immokalee Workers. We do fund them for being who they are. We also fund them because we hope that they will expand the Fair Food Program into Texas agriculture. So all eyes on them about how quickly they are able to do that in this big state, but we are also working on the prevention there. If I had to choose just 1 or 2 things that I think are demonstrably working and are good emerging best practice when it comes to agricultural labor trafficking, I would say we need uncompromised, direct outreach to the high-risk workplaces. What I mean by uncompromised is that when I do my slide of everything that's failing in terms of addressing or identifying labor trafficking, here it is. What I spend a lot of time focusing on is that the system of oversight and outreach to farm workers in most places, including most agricultural workplaces in Texas, is designed to fail. It's designed to do a lot of other things, like make sure that everybody's getting their health care, make sure that children are being enrolled in migrant education programs. But when by design programs are calling the employer or the crew leader to arrange a meeting with the workers, and they meet either with that employer and the workers or with the workers knowing that they are only there with the blessing of the employer, that worker is not in a good position to make a disclosure to that outreach agency, no matter how skilled they are, how good their language capacity is, how culturally competent they are. If there is even a perception that that outreach worker is going to turn around and give that outcry right back over the perpetrator, we are setting it up to fail. So it's not a referendum on the good work of amazing agencies like the Texas Workforce Commission, Department of Labor, but we are not being proactive in the way that we can be about speaking to workers in a space where they can speak with some expectation of privacy and confidentiality, and with the expectation that they will get to make the choice about what happens next. They may want to disclose something to learn what their rights are without having to go all the way to calling 911 that afternoon. So I think that in our limited experience putting out outreach workers into the field, having conversations, we have been successful in opening up lines of communication like that. So that is one thing I'll say. The last thing I'll mention, kind of related to that, another thing that we've seen worked is when, for example, the Hidalgo County DA goes on local news to say in Spanish, this is my name, this is what we do. If you're a victim, we don't care what your documentation status is, we want to hear what's happening to you. We've seen that be effective. I haven't done research to tell you that's more or less effective than Blue Campaign or putting a billboard. I think we can try it all. But we know that when it is attempted to just get that direct message out from a local leader to that local constituency, the calls have come in, and we already are seeing prosecutions and cases moving along because we've made that pitch locally and not just sort of from 10,000 feet above. So I'll leave it there.
Good, thanks. We'll go back around, but I'm glad we come this way, because I'm going to call on myself for a second. Because I'm the odd man out, and I also want to note that we're all men up here, and I think that's a really good idea. You know, especially when we're at a conference when it's almost all majority women, and then we've got these three guys. Okay. They're okay. These guys go. I like that. The reason why I want to point to myself for a second is that I'm here with three Texans. And one of the things about Texas is that it is, of course, a country in its own right. It's a republic and all that sort of thing. But when you get Texans together and they talk about this issue, they get right down into the weeds. I mean, all the way down into Hidalgo County. They're talking about, and most, even though we're talking about what works and what best serves, all three of you in some ways have touched primarily on identification and contact, how to reach them. And I think we spend a lot of time on that, as of course we should, because we've got to find the people who need the help and get that help to them and help them to help themselves and so forth. But I think there's these longer and larger conversations that we need to at least think about, especially in these open spaces where we've got all our brains in the same place. I'm going to throw out a crazy little phrase, 40 acres and a mule, right? We have in our own country's history this idea that if at the end of the Civil War, people who understood exactly what was going on in most of the Deep South understood that a farm family, could support itself if they had about 40 acres and at least one strong mule. Now I have to tell you, my grandfather was born into a sharecropper family, and he had a mule, and he had a lot of acres, and he could support a family, way back in the day. And so it works, it was a reasonable thing. Did it happen? No. But in many ways, I hold that phrase in my mind a lot, because when I've worked in places like India, where I see a law on the books that says when a person is identified and contacted and comes out of a situation of hereditary debt bondage or whatever type of slavery it is, they are immediately given a certificate that they are a freed bonded laborer. And that certificate they can take to a government office, and they will be given a chunk of money, which will be their immediate food, clothing, and shelter allowance, followed by a conversation in which they say you have another much larger amount of money coming due to you, which you can choose to use to set yourself up in a way that will best help you and your family move forward. Now, we're not there yet. We're just not there yet. But what happens is they speak with someone, and normally they have an NGO helping them and so forth, and they'll say, yeah, if I have that much money, I can buy 3 cows, and I can start selling milk in the neighborhood. Or I can buy a bicycle repair toolkit, and I can repair bicycles. Or very commonly, women who have come out of different types of enslavement, in especially the rural parts of India, will buy 5 cell phones. Why? Because there are no phones at all in their communities, and they become the phone company. So they buy them for X rupees, and then it's like, you want to call your mom over there? It's like 10 rupees, no problem. So they're, in a sense, they're the phone company. It immediately gives that little injection, capital injection, that allows the emergence of the freedom dividend. In other words, there's a dividend that comes from unleashing the potential in human beings who have come out of total control and exploitation. And if you foster that dividend, that freedom dividend, you create economies that suddenly spiral up. It's what we've seen in other countries. I can talk about it in other countries as well. And it's kind of an interesting that, the country that prides itself on being the enterprise and free enterprise leader of the planet doesn't apply those concepts to saying, you've just come out of an exploitative situation in agriculture, you know how to do agriculture, how would you like to have a garden assigned to you where you can grow vegetables to sell in the market? And you can use that as a stepping stone to do something you might like even better. I'd love to hear from all of you now, if there had been a particular thing that, in your case, Stephen, and maybe you already know what it is, but that would have been the perfect sort of step for you to take. It would have maybe in fact your life has turned out in a nice way that way. You could say, you know, the step that you wish you could have taken was or is the step that you did take that helped you to achieve that freedom dividend. But I'd also like to hear from you guys about how do we maximize a freedom dividend for the people that once we have found them and identified them?
Step that I would have taken.
I mean, besides the singing star in Las Vegas thing.
I think the biggest thing for me was, I don't know that I would change anything. I think going through the education for me was probably the biggest thing. And then knowing that my family back home in Zambia was okay was also the big thing, because as long as I knew that they were safe and I was safe, then I was okay with that. But the biggest thing I think is just having a community of people that believe in you and what you're trying to accomplish in your life. And somebody that's going to be there to understand what you've been through. Because it's easy to look at somebody and say, you know, you've been through a tough situation, let me see if I can help you out. And then you help that person out for 2-3 months, and then you're gone and you're nowhere to be found. I think if you have somebody there that's willing to walk with you for a long period of time, then you can really make a difference in somebody else's life. And having a community around you that believes in you, that loves you, is a big thing. I know when I went to middle school, I didn't speak any English, so it was pretty hard for me to go to school and be in a classroom with a whole bunch of kids that knew, at least in my mind, knew what they were doing. But I had a lot of teachers that were there, and my mom at that particular point in time, who's still here today, she would go to the classrooms and talk to the teachers and tell them, look, he's a foreign student, he's been through a very hard situation, so maybe you may want to not speak so fast when you're speaking to him. And sometimes she would go up to them and tell them, you know, maybe you may want to scale back a little bit on his homework. And for me, I didn't want that favor. I wanted to just kind of do everything on my own and say, you know, if I'm in a classroom, I don't want you to cut me any slack. I want to just be able to do everything that everybody else is doing. But it was having all those teachers that, you know, loved me and showed that they cared about me. To this day, some of them I'm still in contact with them after like 18 years that I've known them. It was having that, and then people at the church as well that were, you know, understanding of my situation, lending their support in whatever way that I needed. If it was just, you know, sometimes even just a scholarship, you talk about some of the things that you can do. Sometimes it's not just listening to somebody, but what can you do from a financial standpoint? You know, I know everybody's probably, you know, strapped with, you know, finances and whatnot, and we all have our struggles and whatnot. But even just sometimes even just $100, just giving it to an individual and saying, you know, I know you need books, or I know you need blah 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 for your son, but here you go. Maybe you can use this for your family to help you out. So I believe there's a lot of different things that you can do. I'm not gonna try again to filibuster everything. I'm gonna pass it on to Bill so he can have his take, and then maybe I'll jump back in again after that.
So I think the key thing you're getting at is resilience, right? Building the context of care and relationships that give you the personal resilience. I was foolishly talking primarily about economic jobs and so forth, and education like that. But of course, if you don't have that foundation in relationships that builds that personal resilience, the rest of it's not going to come out as well. So now that you've done that, let's let Bill tell us how you move from there.
And I'm just going to have to stand up again because I don't want to put myself asleep while I'm talking. Especially,
I might always do.
Especially, you know, Kevin gave the lead in about this keeping the straight face. But first, I have to morph into this with a, you know, coming back to something Gonzalo said, because I think that's really crucial towards, again, getting somebody, you know, out of these situations. Is he said something which is really unheard of. In fact, he had a county that had both the district attorney and lead prosecutor specifically dedicated to human trafficking work. I mean, I've been trying to do that here for 15 years. I mean, there's a lot of personnel, that get assigned to it within their departments, that's not their only work. And this kind of work takes more time, may not produce results, so they're not always encouraged to spend all their time doing it. So, you know, it's phenomenal what they're doing, you know, what they're doing. And by the way, I met Gonzalo. He used to be from another part of the country. He did this kind of work up, was in New York, right?
Kevin said I'm a Texan though, so now.
I'm sorry.
This is the first time ever.
Well, I can authenticate that Gonzalo is now a Texan.
Okay.
But that's great stuff, you know. And he mentioned the Coalition of Immokalee Workers. There was a presidential award for work in human trafficking, and Coalition of Immokalee Workers got that award a couple of years ago, a few years ago. When there was, I don't know if they're still doing it now. So I wanted to mention all that. One thing I can say that's happening here is that we're very fortunate because, you know, the question is really, you know, what enables people once they're out of the situation to establish lives for themselves. We're, I think, in a sort of a unique, unusual situation because and my agency does pretty, you know, we have the case managers who are sort of the core. They speak 25 different languages. They work with people. And people feel more comfortable working with them if they're from the same part of the world. We have counseling. In addition to the case managers, we have a counseling program. We have legal services. Right now we have 5 attorneys on staff, 2 of whom do only human trafficking work, and we have a shelter. What's happened really recently is that a lot of money from Congress has really gone into the Department of Justice to serve people that were trafficked. And that's really helping these people establish new lives for themselves. So that's sort of the best that I can say about this, because that's what we see. Because we have people that come, we're able to just, you know, we had 2 different grants. We recently just got another one specifically directed at housing, so we can put people in housing. If they go to the shelter, you know, that's fine. When they leave the shelter, we can help them get a place at an apartment complex, hopefully. The shelter is for women, so if it's a male, we generally been putting them in a motel. But all these funding sources that are coming from this, I mean, it's like just exponentially expounded because, you know, you were talking about the financial aspect of it. Well, that's what helps people because then they are able to get in the community, they are able to find a way, they're able to start earning a living. So, you know, it's hard for me to talk about it from the ground up for somebody that doesn't have those resources because I know that's a little bit of a different situation. Probably Gonzalo sees those more than I do back where he is. But, you know, I want to come back to his point about, again, and the reason I'm talking about this in a way is because of what Kevin said about what's happening in India, giving that support. So the support here is a little bit different. It's not quite as maybe comprehensive or work inspiring as the other is, but it's good to see. But, you know, with all these combinations of things, we think things happening. But what I wanted to come back to was that when things like that start happening in one area, if those kinds of things can be used as a model for other places to establish that sort of work, it will permeate all aspects of the trafficking work so that people are able to establish lives for themselves. We've seen good results here. I mean, the people that are in these situations, you know, it's just like we always say, refugees are survivors. People that are in these kinds of situations are survivors, and they are going to manage for themselves. Just like Given was saying, when he was in school, he didn't want special treatment. He wanted to plug away and get what he could and learn what he could. That's what we see for people who've been in these situations. They're going to succeed, and you know, and even a boost along the way. And you know, we're just fortunate that in a lot of places that is happening.
Wait, Bill, don't sit down.
Okay.
Yeah, because I'm going to hold your feet to fire a little bit. In that you've actually told us a lot about systems and processes. Could you just give us one example of one of your clients? And I appreciate, you know, social, where that you said, hey, that really worked out well. And here, and not the process and not the system, but here's the specific type of support that led to the flourishing of that life.
You know, it's hard to separate the specifics from the system because, I mean, like the first example that came to my mind when you said that was, there was a woman who came as a couple with her husband from another country. They were coming to visit relatives. They're coming to Dallas. Well, you don't want the whole story, but anyway, they get trapped in the situation. They're working in a nursing home, 24 hours a day on call. And the woman is pregnant. She goes to Parkland Hospital. That's the county hospital in Dallas. And while she's there, she gets on a computer and starts looking up what she's going through. And so she makes a call. She calls us. And the reason I'm telling this story is because it has a nice ending. I mean, The family was really just completely down about what was going on. They didn't know what was happening. Law enforcement didn't get involved in it. They didn't feel like they could pursue a case out of it. But we applied. There is a visa, and people are entitled. If they're here, if they're not documented, they can get legal status through this visa called the T visa. And so, once that was granted, suddenly, I mean, these people were coming to our office like every few weeks, and they just looked so down and depressed. And suddenly one day they showed up and they looked 10 years younger. I'm really not exaggerating. And so that act, again, it's within the system. But the fact that they got that, meaning suddenly they were enabled to work. She went back to school. She got her master's in jurisprudence at SMU. She's not teaching in Houston. I mean, so, you know, those results we see. I mean, there's a lot of different results I can go on there, but, you know, I want to stick with that one. So when somebody has that opportunity, and by the way, that is one way that the U.S. government has really, in a lot of ways, you know, the social service component may not be there as much as it is in many countries, but this aspect of being allowed to remain in the country if you are identified as somebody that's been trafficked is a huge thing. And so we see that really helping people, helping them thrive.
The T visa is far superior to anything we have in the United Kingdom.
Right, right. That's
You can sit down. But a flag, I can still see all of you. Yeah. I just want to flag the key thing you said about what works, which is about access to education. Because I want to come back to that in a moment. Yeah.
I'll pick up sort of where we left off there. You know, there's what we have in place to work, and there is the reality of how we use those systems. When you were sharing your example, your great example about the remedies that they have available in India, I was sort of translating what each of those elements is supposed to be in the United States. And I should say, because we've been focusing on so many foreign-born victims, there are plenty of victims of human trafficking who do not have a documentation status problem, and that immigration remedies are not the top priority. But as long as we are talking about that population, before we even get to the T visa, we are supposed to have continued presence, which the feds would put under the feet of anyone who would want to have a regularized immigration status while they cooperate with an investigation. In theory, that's supposed to facilitate cooperation from victims and witnesses to these situations with folks who want to do something to find criminal justice for them. In reality, it's highly discretionary whether or not they want to give someone that privilege or not. Some agencies hold all the cards when it comes to that. So you have plenty of great examples around the country where it's being used effectively. You have plenty of places where you see the numbers drop from one year to the next, one leader to the next. You know, these are real decisions that are being made by folks who run those agencies. So that's one place that the public might have a little room to advocate if that's interesting to you in terms of this issue. Beyond that, on the financial side, we have the Trafficking Victim Assistance Program, TVAP, and technically every community in the United States is in some way covered at the federal level through the Office of Victims of Crime or Health and Human Services, so that if someone is pre-certified, sort of forget, you know, the getting all the way to the finish line, again, just like with the T and the continued presence, there is a status for folks who are still sorting out what happened and whether or not they will meet the eligibility to be fully certified as victims of human trafficking. Even in that limbo stage, we are supposed to have pre-certification to allow folks to have, in addition to the immigration remedy, a little bit of financial ground under their feet. So just like you said in your example in India, food, shelter, mental health services, I've seen it work. More often than not, I've seen it not applied. And I think that's where we have a blind spot, that we have to constantly train our agencies on the resources, then we constantly have to fight for the political will to focus on labor. You may find jurisdictions that are using the systems, but only for one or two typologies of human trafficking. What about the other 23? You know, there's plenty to talk about there. But in the best cases, since we are focusing on good examples, you know, I've seen folks go from continued presence and from receiving HHS subgrantee services all the way through to being able to achieve some type of criminal justice, whatever that meant in that particular case. Now we happen to work with one survivor down in the Rio Grande Valley who was a survivor of agricultural labor trafficking. because of his new legal status to live and work in the United States, he's been able to switch from agriculture to a whole different industry. He's a trucker now. And that has given him a new avenue for growth. You saw what his life was like when he was being taken state to state by an abusive crew leader, and what it is now when he's putting a down payment on his home, when he's raising a family, when he's going to events like this, training law enforcement on what went wrong in his case. That obviously it's an example that the system can work when all the pieces come together. But yeah, everybody really does have to do their part.
I think that's such an important example, and also points to the paradox of the American response, in that that's the American story. You work hard, you get a break, you move up from agriculture, you get to be a trucker, you invest in your own home, right? That's what it's supposed, that's the dream. Right? Except that, if you've been caught up in trafficking and slavery, and you fundamentally had all of your work stolen from you, so that you have nothing at the end of however long you've been working and working and working, you end up with zero, not in a sense almost less than zero, you're destitute often. Then there's a question of, yes, you can get this service and that service, and if you get the right happy mixture, you can end up with a good story. If you end up in the wrong county and you don't get the right happy mixture, you're sort of shuffling along from almost lunch ticket to lunch ticket. And the one I'd point to in particular is we have no systematic way to say to younger people, but they don't have to be younger either, or any age person who's come out of trafficking, here's a ticket for you to take to the most appropriate local educational institution for you. You know, one of the things that so many survivors have said to me is, I want to go back to school. I want to go to school. I know that I'm on a ladder of life, and I know that I've been knocked off that ladder, and all these years have been stolen from me. But if I could go back to where I was and just get on the ladder, I'd be at school getting the preparation, the education, the skill sets that I want to do. I've been going around for a long time, and I want to say this to these TCU students and stuff like that who are sitting here, saying, why doesn't every university in the United States at least set aside 1 or 2 scholarships for survivors of trafficking and slavery? Right? Why not? Just an appropriate one. Say this is our population. This is our problem. This is why don't we do this? Shamir McKenzie is a survivor of enslavement and commercial sexual exploitation, and she set up her own NGO that does nothing but raise funds, which they give as book grants and tuition grants to survivors in order to go to appropriate levels of education. You know, in some ways, it was a trick question when I started the whole thing, and say, what works? The thing is, we know what works. You get some education, you get your job training, you get some skills, you get a resilient community, you get people around you who help you, like give you something about it. And then you have great organizations which are underfunded and understaffed often, who are doing their very best to put these things together, but even the system that they have to deal with is piecemeal. Absolutely piecemeal.
So our experience with education,
Yeah.
the admissions area of the universities don't understand T-visa. So they wanted to take him in as an international student and charge international tuition. So we had to go in and educate with every step, every college. He has a T-visa, he's legal, we pay in-state tuition. So I don't know if the colleges have now been more informed in the admissions office, but that would certainly be a big step for helping those that are trying to go.
I see this as a, yes ma'am.
I got a great solution. I'm glad that we hear about the agriculture, because I believe in the kind of organizing where the people are affected or involved.
No, speak up so everyone.
But up in New Hampshire, they have farm workers, and when asked if you report labor abuse, I like to use labor exploitation rather than modern day slavery, which is kind of an insult to our history of slavery. ICE shows up at the farm and they get deported. So when the DA goes on TV and says, don't worry, we're not going to deport you, we're going to give out these TVs, even before Trump, 2/3 of trafficking victims or people exploited were deported. They also know that if they don't say we thought we were going to be a hostess, that they're going to be deported. Okay, so But what they did, this was amazing in Vermont. They started, they can't go to the labor board and complain like we can. So they organized Milk for Dignity, which shamed Ben & Jerry's ice cream to sign MOAs with farms that treated their workers right. And they won. So I think helping to empower the people affected rather than, I mean, we see all over the TV, ICE is coming, they're kidnapping your kid. When they go back to their home country, they already have heard about the other people that were deported. So this idea that you have to prove status, you have to help prosecute people that you might be scared of or you don't really know who they are. But I think as far as agriculture, which is really overlooked, that turned out to be a really good way for them to gain power back and not involve ICE and not involve the government.
Could I, just because it's an interesting example, there are a lot of folks, and I think the model, you know, as you know, came out of the immobility workers model, and they worked closely with the Florida workers to replicate that in the dairy industry in Vermont. Many of the organizers of that campaign have been apprehended by ICE, so, you know, I mean, yes and no. They've made progress, but they're tangling up with the same systemic issues that we see across the board. I'm not close to that part of the country at this moment, so I couldn't tell you, how direct that link was between the organizing and the apprehensions. But even for a group that wanted to find an alternative outside of the formal system for remedies, they're tripping all over it. And that's mainly what they've been introduced about late after that campaign. There's no escaping kind of that bigger context right now.
I want to open it up to other questions now because we're in that sort of 15 to 20 minutes left.
And I have like a 10-second comment. I just want to
Yeah,
make
you got 20.
Okay, 20. Oh, wow. Well, I didn't, 15 years ago, he wasn't that generous. We really, I just want to sort of make everybody point out that, because we're talking about labor trafficking, I give another example, you even talked about something. The reality is pretty much any occupation you can think of, anywhere where an unscrupulous individual can take advantage of somebody else and make money and finds a way to do it, it's going to happen. So I want to throw that out because, literally we don't have time, but I usually give examples of about 7 or 8 different types of cases that have been uncovered in different parts of the country of trafficking around here and in other parts of the country. So it's happening everywhere. It's happening around us. Don't ever think it isn't. I just wanted to throw that out.
And I think this goes to education. You were saying that why isn't there scholarships in schools that offers, to these trafficking victims? Because I think the public doesn't understand what trafficking is. For example, when I was going to college, like Mom said, we had to try to prove that I was a trafficking victim, and they thought I was an international student. So instead of me paying in-state tuition, they were wanting to charge out-of-state tuition, and as international students. So that, I think, compounds the problem in a lot of ways. So I think if you can educate not just schools, but you can go to your churches, in your neighborhood, anybody that you know. Reading is also another good thing that you can do. I know Kevin's written a lot of books, so if you want to understand what trafficking is, and even some of the stuff that we use every single day. Some of the coffee that we drink is by slave labor, trafficking, for example. And it breaks your heart to know that there's still so many people, not just around the world, but here in the United States. Because a lot of times when I was telling people about my situation, that I was a human trafficking victim, a lot of them used to think, oh, you were trafficked in Africa and then you came to the United States as a survivor. And then I tell them, no, I was actually trafficked here in the United States. And for a lot of people, that's a shock. But I think the thing that's missed in that whole thing is that, if people can find somebody that's vulnerable and try to abuse that person, in a lot of ways people are going to do that. Because I think just part of it is just human nature. And that's where you have to come in with a good heart. And that's a constant battle every single day to be a good person to somebody else. Even though we all have our own needs, everybody wants what I want and what I can do for me and my family and my kids and my brothers and sisters. But what can you do for somebody else that's in need? I think that's probably a bigger question to me when you're talking about this whole thing.
Let's what would someone like to add or ask? Yes, ma'am.
I work at a Children's Advocacy Center, and with our population, obviously it's children, but when it comes to the trafficking aspect, it really is structured around sex trafficking. So my question is, what would be considered trafficking for a child? Because we'll get intakes that say that Johnny is being forced to work after school to help support his family, which, I mean, helping the parents pay bills and things like that. And so he has a legitimate job and he's working so many hours. At what point is that considered trafficking? Because if Johnny doesn't want to work anymore, but his parents are saying, you still have to work.
Yeah, I don't think you can pin the trafficking on maybe child exploitation. So that's the problem, because there's a lot of gray areas.
Right.
You know, for example, any type of labor, we get calls about people with this wage exploitation, and it may sound almost like trafficking, or it may not quite cross that line with them. So the bottom line is somebody's coerced. If it's a child, of course, then forced form of coercion doesn't apply, because you assume that they're being controlled by somebody else. But still, whether it's trafficking, I'm probably not the best person to identify whether it's trafficking or not.
Well, the key there is if it's a child, that's a whole nother thing. And that has to be checked into on child labor concerns, because you can, it's not, it doesn't cross that line. If they become adults, the rule of thumb, and the rule of thumb I use when I'm in the field, because often I'm in different developing world countries, and you can see people in situations in which which they seem to be totally under the control of other people. But the rule of thumb that I ask myself is, can they walk away? Because the fundamental difference with enslavement is that you simply cannot walk away, even into a worse situation. So, enslavement is about the total control of one person by another. Violence is used to maintain that control. The point of that violent control is exploitation. It could be sexual, could be commercial, could be labor, or whatever. And you are not allowed to walk away. So that's the fundamental sort of subjective definition of what slavery is. You can define it legally, and sadly, in this country we have like 17 or 20 different legal definitions of trafficking and slavery. The United Nations has 4 different definitions that disagree with each other. So we work hard, certainly at my research institute, to say, what's an operational definition that we can that actually describes the thing that's happening. And I'll also throw in that we are now altering fundamentally the key concepts, the key logical concepts of the definition of enslavement through the guidance of survivors. So we've been incubating the Global Survivor Alliance, and now have more than 100 survivors around the world who feed into this and say, well, yeah, you guys would say that because you've never been in this situation. But I can tell you that if you've been there, it looks a little bit more like this. And that's really helping.
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
I know Kevin wants to say something, but I just have one real quick comment that, when Kevin says you can't walk away, that control, if it's psychological, is even more powerful than physical control. So it's not necessarily a locked door, but it may be even stronger.
That's exactly what I was going to say.
See why I love this?
It's control is, you can control somebody in a lot of ways, more than just financially, physically, emotional. If you've been coerced for a long time, that I'm the only person that can help you through this situation. Psychologically, you don't know how to get away from that situation.
Yeah.
How are you going to move away from this person to go seek help from somebody else? And that's I would almost argue that psychological abuse is much worse than physical abuse. And I've experienced both, and getting through both of them is much, much harder. So there's a lot of, you say, how what was your question? You said?
That the parents are making the child work after school.
Yeah, but do they have a work permit, and what age are they at? And you would have to look into labor laws and all that, and what age the person can work and whatnot. But it's, as far as somebody, are they being forced to work and not, and can they get away from that situation? There's a lot of factors that you have to think about before you can just make that generalization, I think.
Did you want to add anything? I want to make sure we get everyone's ideas from
Yeah, just a quick one just for the state of Texas. So there's child labor, there's legal child labor, there's illegal types of child labor, there's child labor exploitation, and there's human trafficking and labor trafficking for children. And just because it's a family, just because they are being controlled by their parents or family, of course, does not necessarily rule out that there's force, fraud, and coercion that would meet the standard, even under the many definitions that we have. These cases have been out in the public view for a long time. A good example to look at is the Ohio egg farm case, Trillium Farms, Central American unaccompanied minors, federal trafficking charges. The hard and fast rule for Texas is if you have someone under the age of 14, there can be exceptions, but there are very few exceptions for why a child under 14 should be working. So there's something to look at right there. But you know, let's dig into what the control is. Yes, of course, there are very normal ways that parents control the children. What if the threat is, if you go away, we will kill your pet? If you don't pay off this debt by X day, then we'll kick you out of the house. There are ways that it becomes human trafficking, and I want to make sure that we keep screening for that. Yeah.
Thoughts, questions? Yes.
Well, I think, especially labor trafficking is difficult to identify for the general public, but there are signs, So when a person goes to different social services, like for example, the doctor can identify certain things that may point to a situation, and then can you help identify? Because I think we best serve, the population at large, best serve the victims of human trafficking by IDing them, That's the first step, because this is all like, it's like the dark web, it's hidden away from the public. So how does the public effect, have ways to identify when a situation may point to labor trafficking, not just sex trafficking. And the interesting thing is that many of the manifestations of the trafficking are similar, in the case of sex and labor, because you have, but sex is just another type of labor. So it's basically, it's all encompassing in labor.
I think the point you raise is just, I wanted to separate two parts of it, to say, on one side you were saying, are there some sort of warning signs and indicators by which we can identify? And the other one is about how do we actually determine is this enslavement or trafficking or not? And I've got things to say about it.
Well, yeah, I was just going to jump in with one quick thing. There's a lot of different questions that people talk about that you can ask people. And again, you don't want to do that in a situation where you don't know what's going on, there's some danger or something. But if it's somebody you happen to see on a regular basis in a dry cleaner, for example, or a nail salon, of all the different questions, there's one that I've heard that another agency that's been doing this work for a long time says that they found makes a lot of sense, and that's, if you're being paid, do you get to keep the money? Because in a lot of these things, are you being paid? Yeah, people are being paid. I mean, technically, Gibbon was paid, but he didn't end up with any money at the end of the month. And in almost every case that we have seen, it's been like that. Like the people, whether workers from Korea that were working in one place or from Central America, they're all technically being paid, but they got to pay so much back for rent, food, that they end up with no money at the end of the month. So, it's a simple question. It doesn't look too threatening. You're being paid, you get to keep the money.
And in terms of determining, is this slavery or trafficking, or whichever way you want to call it, another good rule of thumb actually goes back, forgive me, this sounds slightly convoluted, but before there was a League of Nations, there was the United Nations, there was the League of Nations, but it actually passed a global slavery convention in 1926. And almost all legal scholars have now agreed that that's actually the best legal definition, because it calls upon fundamental laws of property. And it says, you don't have to be, it says if a person is treated as if they are property. Not that they are legal property, but if they are treated as if they are property. And then you run through the criteria that determines what you can do with your property. And if you think about it for 10 seconds, you realize, aha, because if you think, okay, that pen in your hand is your property. What can you do with it? You could sell it. You could take out a loan against it. You could leave it to your children. You could rent it out, right? You could use it as collateral against the loan. And you can destroy it. And you can use it. Right? So if you can do that to a human being, any of those things to a human being, that's as if you own them, and that turns it into slavery. Terry wanted to ask.
I do. I come from Florida, so I know what you're talking about of seeing some very innovative things. We happen to be lucky enough to have some people from Homeland Security in our coalition that they are asking those kind of very specific questions that you're saying, and being an advocate. What have you found successful in getting buy-in from the legal side or the prosecutory side?
It's almost a personality issue.
Because I'm looking from an education, do you get the buy-in?
And Gonzalo probably has a better answer to this than I do, because I know, again, for many years, we've been trying at both the local, Fort Worth police. For example, when we first started doing this work, there was a big case, one of the biggest cases, nationally, earliest cases, was a case in Fort Worth a long time ago. And it was because of these two very observant, astute vice unit officers that I mentioned earlier. Right now, there's an agent for the FBI in Dallas who's into it, and he's proactively pursuing labor trafficking cases. And, in the past, they wouldn't have let him do that. So I'm saying all that because that's what we've seen. It just takes the right person who's willing to do it, who has a supervisor that's willing to let him do it, and somehow they get buy-in. It's tough.
Bill is focusing on the law enforcement side, but at the end of the day, one of the big leverage points can also be the prosecutor. And what's interesting about that is that they are very much, depending on which, feds are appointed, but local DAs are elected, and they listen. They listen to where the public interest is. If folks are, coming back to your question, what can we do? If you look at the low-hanging fruit, just look at your most frequent flyer in the area in terms of wage and hour violations. What company is in there every year? What company has exploitation as a part of doing business? Half the time, these are open secrets. But we don't have to wait until someone to kick the window down and make an outcry to the police. We sort of know where the really bad exploitation is taking place. If you put pressure on your local electeds to begin to focus in on it, then yeah, that pressure might percolate down to your local agent.
And one thing that I've seen that it takes what he's pulled off in Hidalgo County, which is you get one person that's their job, that's his or her job. I mean, otherwise it's a challenge. But if you get one person, you got to prosecute. I won't go into the challenges that we run into hearing from enforcement officials about both federal and local prosecutors. That's what stops things. But if you have, prosecutors willing to get into it, if you have, if they assign one person in different offices to do this work, and that's what they're tasked with, it opens up a whole different world.
Little known secret, every district, every federal prosecutorial district in the country has a human trafficking liaison.
Mm-hmm.
Some have leaned into the title more than others, but they have it. They have it by law. They have to have it.
I don't want to say anything about North Texas, but there's some places that are really good at it.
100 people with good wishes may do something, but one person that carries a can actually gets something there.
There's two things that I haven't heard about, not that I have solutions, but that seem to be ignored a lot, and one is domestic workers that is tied to their actual visas.
Yeah.
And the second is the 13th Amendment, where we lock people up for nonviolent crimes, especially for not paying a fine. And then we have them fighting fires in California for $2 a day, or Whole Foods and their fishing industry. And somehow we blame people, because I'm pretty sure every one of us has committed some kind of crime. And it seems like no attention is really going to how abusive and why is this okay. And I know even with the domestic workers, they won't even let them organize or unionize. And the fact that it's tied to that T visa seems to me that is making it easier for them to exploit.
There's no link between organizing people who have been trafficked with T visas. I mean, those are two separate things. But it was actually back in the 1930s when they exempted domestic workers and agricultural workers from all labor legislation. That was a deal done with the Southern senators from the Deep South to pass that legislation during the Depression. So what that was about. The other question you raised, though, about prison is a very interesting one. I know it's one of enormous focus in the United States today. If you let me step back for a second, because though I grew up in America, I live abroad and I work all over the world. And one of the things that we look at
in our lab, and our lab has more than 120 researchers working on contemporary forms of slavery. We look at that type of slavery called state-sponsored slavery. We had it in this country in spades after the Civil War, when you had what was called the peonage system, but fundamentally the legal system enabled the re-enslavement of hundreds and hundreds of thousands of African Americans between 1870 and 1940. Then they kind of tried to wipe it out because it was getting to be too embarrassing as the war started. But here's the key thing. In most of the places in the world where you have state-sponsored slavery, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Burma, China, in a big way, really big way, you have at least the ability that we haven't achieved yet to demonstrate both the intentionality and the clear linkages by which decisions are made to take people and put them into a situation where they're in a state-controlled prison in order to make a profit. Now, I'm going to say this, I'll say this as a foreigner, and you can take it as you like, but I have to say that looking at the prison systems that are controlled by state-sponsored slavery systems in other countries of the world, and looking at what goes on here, I say it looks like a duck, it quacks like a duck, it swims like a duck, it poops like a duck, but I can't quite say it's a duck yet, because the proof, the evidential linkages that would demonstrate those steps where people make a political decision that, yes, we will arrest these people, and it's on record, right? And do that, and then we're going to produce these goods and sell these goods abroad to fund back to, right? I believe out there somewhere there's an investigative journalistic team that's going to crack this open by forging absolutely rock-solid evidence of those links. And then this will go, America will go on record as being not as bad as China, which has built a prison factory system across the entire country and has been operating for 20 years. All those Christmas baubles you get, they come from prison factories, right? All those little stuffed toys from prison factories. And they arrest, and the other part of it is that as here, they completely disrupted the concept of due process. So you don't end up in that prison in China because you've been arrested, charged, tried, and convicted. You often end up in that prison in China because they pick you up off the street for being the wrong ethnic group and put you directly into the prison, and that's the end of the story. So we're in an ugly situation in this country where the system has been pushed right up to the same kind of situation that you would find in some of the worst dictatorships in the world. And I think there's a chance to be able to pull it back, even though there's been enormous human damage so far. But if we think it through carefully, I think Americans wouldn't want to do that. They wouldn't want to. We're 1.5 minutes from when we're supposed to stop. Last words, like one sentence long.
Great job.
Bill, anything?
One really encouraging thing that I mentioned earlier was we've really seen a difference. The first few years, we had a sporadic referral, somebody here and there. The last couple of 3 years, it's steady from the community. We get a lot of referrals from law enforcement, mostly sex-based, but we get a lot of labor trafficking referrals from the community, from people like all of us here. So that means people are becoming more aware. I think you mentioned that awareness. It's really happening, so it's encouraging.
Yeah, along the same lines, get to know the risk profile of your local context. We know the numbers. It's not a surprise anymore. It shouldn't be a surprise anymore. There are industries that are hitting 10, 15% incidence rates. Get to know which are they, what are their names in your area, have they been in the news for other related crimes, could there be trafficking, is it being investigated, who would be the one to investigate it. That's the low-hanging fruit in my mind. If we start there, then we can worry about Uzbek cotton and everything else along all the way, but we can start here. Look at that hotspot, I took it down, but yeah, one of the big hotspots in Texas is just northeast of here, so,
And my last thought is this. You're right, Bill's right, we're in a better situation than we have been in the past. I'll just tell you that as we've tracked the amount of funds globally that are moving into anti-slavery, anti-trafficking work. They've turned into it used to be a line moving up, now it's a curve moving up. And one of the things that we've done to address that is not just to get money, but is to realize that as the funding seems to be moving exponentially, the human resources, the financial resources are going up, the human resources are not increasing at the same rate. We've established a new online master's degree called the MA in Slavery and Liberation, which trains people how to get people out of slavery, right, out of trafficking. So if you want to know about that, it's online, so you can do it from Texas. I'll give you a card for it. Thank you. Anything burning in anyone's heart that they just have to get off, besides thank you to these guys?